4. For reasons she would not explain, Edith did not want to be married in St. Louis, so the wedding was held in Columbia, in the large drawing room of Emma Darley, where they had spent their first hours together. It was the first week in February, just after classes were dismissed for the semester break. The Bostwicks took the train from St. Louis, and William's parents, who had not met Edith, drove down from the farm, arriving on Saturday afternoon, the day before the wedding. Stoner wanted to put them up at a hotel, but they preferred to stay with the Foots, even though the Foots had grown cold and distant since William had left their employ. "Wouldn't know how to do in a hotel," his father said seriously. "And the Foots can put up with us for one night." That evening, William rented a gig and drove his parents into town to Emma Darley's house so that they could meet Edith. They were met at the door by Mrs. Darley, who gave William's parents a brief, embarrassed glance and asked them into the parlor. His mother and father sat carefully, as if afraid to move in their stiff new clothes. "I don't know what can be keeping Edith," Mrs. Darley murmured after a while. "If you'll excuse me." She went out of the room to get her niece. After a long time, Edith came down. She entered the parlor slowly, reluctantly, with a kind of frightened defiance. They rose to their feet, and for several moments the four of them stood awkwardly, not knowing what to say. Then Edith came forward stiffly and gave her hand first to William's mother and then to his father. "How do?" his father said formally, and released her hand as if afraid it would break. Edith glanced at him, tried to smile, and backed away. "Sit down," she said. "Please sit down." They sat. William said something. His voice sounded strange to him. In a silence, quietly and wonderingly, as if she spoke her thoughts aloud, his mother said, "My, she's a pretty thing, isn't she?" William laughed a little and said gently, "Yes, ma'am, she is." They were able to speak more easily then, though they darted glances at each other and then looked away into the distances of the room. Edith murmured that she was glad to meet them, that she was sorry they hadn't met before. "And when we get settled—" She paused, and William wondered if she was going to continue. "When we get settled, you must come to visit us." "Thank you kindly," his mother said. The talk went on, but it was interrupted by long silences. Edith's nervousness increased, became more apparent, and once or twice she did not respond to a question someone asked her. William got to his feet, and his mother, with a nervous look around her, stood also. But his father did not move. He looked directly at Edith and kept his eyes on her for a long time. Finally he said, "William was always a good boy. I'm glad he's getting himself a fine woman. A man needs himself a woman to do for him and give him comfort. Now, you be good to William. He ought to have someone who can be good to him." Edith's head came back in a kind of reflex of shock. Her eyes were wide, and for a moment William thought she was angry. But she was not. His father and Edith looked at each other for a long time, and their eyes did not waver. "I'll try, Mr. Stoner," Edith said. "I'll try." Then his father got to his feet and bowed clumsily and said, "It's getting late. We'd best be going." And he walked with his wife, shapeless and dark and small beside him, to the door, leaving Edith and his son together. Edith did not speak to him, but when he turned to bid her good night, William saw that tears were swimming in her eyes. He bent to kiss her, and he felt the frail strength of her slender fingers on his arms. The cold, clear sunlight of the February afternoon slanted through the front windows of the Darley house and was broken by the figures that moved about in the large parlor. His parents stood curiously alone in a corner of the room. The Bostwicks, who had come in only an hour before on the morning train, stood near them, not looking at them. Gordon Finch walked heavily and anxiously around, as if he were in charge of something. There were a few people, friends of Edith or her parents, whom he did not know. He heard himself speaking to those about him, felt his lips smiling, and heard voices come to him as if muffled by layers of thick cloth. Gordon Finch was beside him. His face was sweaty, and it glowed above his dark suit. He grinned nervously. "You about ready, Bill?" Stoner felt his head nod. Finch said, "Does the doomed man have any last requests?" Stoner smiled and shook his head. Finch clapped him on the shoulder. "You just stick by me. Do what I tell you. Everything's under control. Edith will be down in a few minutes." He wondered if he would remember this after it was over. Everything seemed a blur, as if he saw through a haze. He heard himself ask Finch, "The minister, I haven't seen him. Is he here?" Finch laughed and shook his head and said something. Then a murmur came over the room. Edith was walking down the stairs. In a white dress, she was like a cold light coming into the room. Stoner started involuntarily toward her and felt Finch's hand on his arm restraining him. Edith was pale, but she gave him a small smile. Then she was beside him, and they were walking together. A stranger with a round collar stood before them. He was short and fat, and he had a vague face. He was mumbling words and looking at a white book in his hands. William heard himself responding to silences. He felt Edith trembling beside him. Then there was a long silence and another murmur, and the sound of laughter. Someone said, "Kiss the bride." He felt himself turned. Finch was grinning at him. He smiled down at Edith, whose face swam before him, and kissed her. Her lips were as dry as his own. He felt his hand being pumped. People were clapping him on the back and laughing. The room was milling. New people came in the door. A large cut-glass bowl of punch seemed to have appeared on a long table at one end of the parlor. There was a cake. Someone held his and Edith's hands together. There was a knife. He understood he was supposed to guide her hand as she cut the cake. Then he was separated from Edith and couldn't see her in the throng of people. He was talking and laughing, nodding, and looking around the room to see if he could find Edith. He saw his mother and father standing in the same corner of the room from which they had not moved. His mother was smiling, and his father had his hand awkwardly on her shoulder. He started to go to them, but he could not break away from whoever was talking to him. Then he saw Edith. She was with her father and mother and her aunt. Her father, with a slight frown on his face, was surveying the room as if impatient with it, and her mother was weeping, her eyes red and puffed above her heavy cheekbones, and her mouth pursed downward like a child's. Mrs. Darley and Edith had their arms about her. Mrs. Darley was talking to her rapidly, as if trying to explain something. But even across the room, William could see that Edith was silent. Her face was like a mask, expressionless and white. After a moment, they led Mrs. Bostwick from the room, and William did not see Edith again until the reception was over, until Gordon Finch whispered something in his ear, led him to a side door that opened onto a little garden, and pushed him outside. Edith was waiting there, bundled against the cold, her collar turned up about her face so that he could not see it. Gordon Finch, laughing and saying words that William could not understand, hustled them down a path to the street, where a covered buggy was waiting to carry them to the station. It was not until they were on the train, which would take them to St. Louis for their week's honeymoon, that William Stoner realized that it was all over, and that he had a wife. They went into marriage innocent, but innocent in profoundly different ways. They were both virginal, and they were conscious of their inexperience. But whereas William, having been raised on a farm, took as unremarkable the natural processes of life, they were to Edith profoundly mysterious and unexpected. She knew nothing of them, and there was something within her which did not wish to know of them. And so, like many others, their honeymoon was a failure. Yet they would not admit this to themselves, and they did not realize the significance of the failure until long afterward. They arrived in St. Louis late Sunday night. On the train, surrounded by strangers who looked curiously and approvingly at them, Edith had been animated and almost gay. They laughed and held hands and spoke of the days to come. Once in the city, and by the time William had found a carriage to take them to the hotel, Edith's gaiety had become faintly hysterical. He half carried her, laughing, through the entrance of the Ambassador Hotel, a massive structure of brown cut stone. The lobby was nearly deserted, dark and heavy like a cavern. When they got inside, Edith abruptly quieted and swayed uncertainly beside him as they walked across the immense floor to the desk. By the time they got to their room, she was nearly physically ill. She trembled as if in a fever, and her lips were blue against her chalk-like skin. William wanted to find her a doctor, but she insisted she was only tired, that she needed rest. They spoke gravely of the strain of the day, and Edith hinted at some delicacy that troubled her from time to time. She murmured, but without looking at him, and without intonation in her voice, that she wanted their first hours together to be perfect. And William said, "They are. They will be. You must rest. Our marriage will begin tomorrow." And like other new husbands of whom he had heard, and at whose expense he had at one time or another made jokes, he spent his wedding night apart from his wife, his long body curled stiffly and sleeplessly on a small sofa, his eyes open to the passing night. He awoke early. Their suite, arranged and paid for by Edith's parents as a wedding gift, was on the 10th floor, and it commanded a view of the city. He called softly to Edith, and in a few minutes she came out of the bedroom, tying the sash of her dressing gown, yawning sleepily, smiling a little. William felt his love for her grip his throat. He took her by the hand, and they stood before the window in their sitting room, looking down. Automobiles, pedestrians, and carriages crept on the narrow streets below them. They seemed to themselves far removed from the run of humanity and its pursuits. In the distance, visible beyond the square buildings of red brick and stone, the Mississippi River wound its bluish-brown length in the morning sun. The riverboats and tugs that crawled up and down its stiff bends were like toys, though their stacks gave off great quantities of grey smoke to the winter air. A sense of calm came over him. He put his arm around his wife and held her lightly, and they both gazed down upon a world that seemed full of promise and quiet adventure. They breakfasted early. Edith seemed refreshed, fully recovered from her indisposition of the night before. She was almost gay again, and she looked at William with an intimacy and warmth that he thought were from gratitude and love. They did not speak of the night before. Every now and then Edith looked at her new ring and adjusted it on her finger. They wrapped themselves against the cold and walked the St. Louis streets, which were just beginning to crowd with people. They looked at goods in windows, they spoke of the future, and gravely thought of how they would fill it. William began to regain the ease and fluency he had discovered during his early courtship of this woman who had become his wife. Edith clung to his arm and seemed to attend to what he said as she had never done before. They had mid-morning coffee in a small warm shop and watched the passers-by scurry through the cold. They found a carriage and drove to the art museum. Arm in arm they walked through the high rooms, through the rich glow of light reflected from the paintings. In the quietness, in the warmth, in the air that took on a timelessness from the old paintings and statuary, William Stoner felt an outrush of affection for the tall, delicate girl who walked beside him, and he felt a quiet passion rise within him, warm and formally sensuous, like the colors that came out from the walls around him. When they left there late in the afternoon, the sky had clouded and a thin drizzle had started, but William Stoner carried with him the warmth he had gathered in the museum. They got back to the hotel shortly after sunset. Edith went into the bedroom to rest, and William called downstairs to have a light dinner sent to their rooms. And on a sudden inspiration, he went downstairs himself into the saloon and asked for a bottle of champagne to be iced and sent up within the hour. The bartender nodded glumly and told him that it would not be a good champagne. By the 1st of July, prohibition would be national. Already it was illegal to brew or distill liquors, and there were no more than 50 bottles of champagne of any sort in the cellars of the hotel, and he would have to charge more than the champagne was worth. Stoner smiled and told him that would be all right. Although on special occasions of celebration in her parents' home, Edith had taken a little wine, she had never before tasted champagne. As they ate their dinner, set up on a small square table in their sitting room, she glanced nervously at the strange bottle in its bucket of ice. 2 white candles in dull brass holders glowed unevenly against the darkness. William had turned out the other lights. The candles flickered between them as they talked, and the light caught the curves of the smooth dark bottle and glittered upon the ice that surrounded it. They were nervous and cautiously gay. Inexpertly, he withdrew the cork from the champagne. Edith jumped at the loud report. White froth spurted from the bottle neck and drenched his hand. They laughed at his clumsiness. They drank a glass of the wine, and Edith pretended tipsiness. They drank another glass. William thought he saw a languor come over her, a quietness fall upon her face, a pensiveness darken her eyes. He rose and went behind her, where she sat at the little table. He put his hands upon her shoulders, marveling at the thickness and heaviness of his fingers upon the delicacy of her flesh and bone. She stiffened beneath his touch, and he made his hands go gently to the sides of her thin neck and let them brush into the fine reddish hair. Her neck was rigid, the cords vibrant in their tensity. He put his hands on her arms and lifted gently so that she rose from the chair. He turned her to face him. Her eyes, wide and pale and nearly transparent in the candlelight, looked upon him blankly. He felt a distant closeness to her, and a pity for her helplessness. Desire thickened in his throat so that he could not speak. He pulled her a little toward the bedroom, feeling a quick, hard resistance in her body, and feeling at the same moment a willed putting away of the resistance. He left the door to the unlighted bedroom open. The candlelight glowed feebly in the darkness. He murmured as if to comfort and assure her, but his words were smothered and he could not hear what he said. He put his hands upon her body and fumbled for the buttons that would open her to him. She pushed him away impersonally. In the dimness, her eyes were closed and her lips tight. She turned away from him and with a quick movement loosened her dress so that it fell crumpled about her feet. Her arms and shoulders were bare. She shuddered as if from cold and said in a flat voice, "Go in the other room. I'll be ready in a minute." He touched her arms and put his lips to her shoulder, but she would not turn to him. In the sitting room he stared at the candles that flickered over the remains of their dinner, in the midst of which rested the bottle of champagne, still more than half full. He poured a little of the wine into a glass and tasted it. It had grown warm and sweetish. When he returned, Edith was in bed with the covers pulled to her chin, her face turned upward, her eyes closed, a thin frown creasing her forehead. Silently, as if she were asleep, Stoner undressed and got into bed beside her. For several moments he lay with his desire, which had become an impersonal thing, belonging to himself alone. He spoke to Edith, as if to find a haven for what he felt. She did not answer. He put his hand upon her and felt beneath the thin cloth of her nightgown the flesh he had longed for. He moved his hand upon her. She did not stir. Her frown deepened. Again he spoke, saying her name to silence. Then he moved his body upon her, gentle in his clumsiness. When he touched the softness of her thigh, she turned her head sharply away and lifted her arm to cover her eyes. She made no sound. Afterward, he lay beside her and spoke to her in the quietness of his love. Her eyes were open then, and they stared at him out of the shadow. There was no expression on her face. Suddenly, she flung the covers from her and crossed swiftly to the bathroom. He saw the light go on and heard her retch loudly and agonizingly. He called to her and went across the room. The door to the bathroom was locked. He called to her again. She did not answer. He went back to the bed and waited for her. After several minutes of silence, the light in the bathroom went off and the door opened. Edith came out and walked stiffly to the bed. "It was the champagne," she said. "I shouldn't have had the second glass." She pulled the covers over her and turned away from him. In a few moments, her breathing was regular and heavy in sleep.